This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Lokwe. To tonight's top stories. China and India speeding up talks in a bid to finally resolve a long-running dispute on the Himalayan border, 4 years after a military clash that killed dozens on both sides. North Korea readying for a restart of nuclear talks with the United States should Donald Trump return to office. Well, that's according to a senior diplomat who defected to the south. South Korea says it prepared to offer flood relief to the north amid reports of thousands dead or missing after heavy rain. Japanese stocks fall on investor concerns about a stronger yen. A hike in rates yesterday by the central bank surprising the market. And also head on East Asia tonight, China's People's Liberation Army at 97 years. Reforms that continue and with ever greater urgency as Beijing itself acknowledges the need to address an increasingly complex security landscape. And also head why loneliness is hitting more young people in Japan on this week's CNA Plus. China and India speeding up negotiations, hoping to break long-standing dispute over border issues. Officials have agreed to continue working to maintain the peace by strictly adhering to earlier established protocols. Both parties seeing the need to resolve a standoff along their shared border in the Himalayas. Ties have been strained, especially since a clash in July in 2020 left dead at least 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese personnel. Foreign ministers from both India and China have highlighted the need to find a solution and to bring bilateral ties back on track. The top diplomats met twice this month in Kazakhstan and on the sidelines of the Southeast Asian Bloc ASEAN summit in Laos. And we're joined by Rebecca Bundon from Mumbai and CNA's Olivia Xiong from Beijing. Let's start with Rebecca first. Rebecca, what came out of talks today in New Delhi?
Well, these talks very much take place behind closed doors, and we don't really know the finer details. Those are never released. But what we do know is from the statements that have come out from the Chinese and Indian foreign ministries, and they both seem to be very, very positive, with China saying that they had agreed to speed up negotiations on these border issues and maintain peace and tranquility at the border, and India saying something similar as well, that they reviewed the situation and that they were committed to an early resolution of these outstanding issues, and that they had agreed to maintain peace and tranquility, and that this was in fact essential to normalcy in bilateral relations. India also saying that the talks were constructive, that they were forward-looking, and that the two sides had agreed to maintain this momentum, to work towards this resolution, and that they were committed to going through these established military and diplomatic channels going forwards to resolve this.
Rebecca, as you mentioned, most of these meetings are conducted behind closed doors, but at a rough count, we're looking at least 30 such meetings. Any dispute over territory is very hard to resolve. But in this particular case between China and India, what is making resolving this so very difficult?
Well, it's extremely difficult. This is a border dispute that goes back decades, and China and India both have their own claims, and neither side is going to be willing to back down easily, of course, on the claims that they have. So this makes the situation very, very difficult. Although China and India are both saying that they are committed towards this resolution, that they want to speed up negotiations, it's a tough situation. And this is only reflected in the fact that it was last year that Prime Minister Narendra Modi met his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. And they actually talked about the need for disengagement of troops, that they wanted to accelerate this, But now it's almost 1 year on, and we haven't seen much movement. This is still an ongoing issue, although some troops may have been moved from some places. There's still tens of thousands of troops at the border. So that just goes to show how big this issue is, and that it's going to be a long process to resolve this. It's also the fact that those wounds are very deep when we look at what happened back in 2020, those military clashes in Ladakh when there were 20 Indian troops that were killed. China said that 4 of its soldiers were killed. These wounds are very, very deep, and that's only making these negotiations all the more difficult as well. It's a complex matter, and it's not something that can be easily resolved, despite both sides saying they are committed to this resolution.
Olivia from Beijing. Now, we just heard Rebecca that publicly China would say it supports these talks. It supports reaching some kind of resolution on this 3,400-kilometre long border. But what has the foreign ministry said, the very latest, about this meeting?
Wait, so it's a rather positive tone that Rebecca has mentioned there, and that's what exactly we are seeing from the Chinese foreign ministry so far in its statements after we had seen that low in relations following that 2020 clash. And in the last 4 years, officials on both sides agreeing to speed up negotiations to maintain peace in the border areas. The Chinese foreign ministry also saying that this time they are agreeing, that both sides have agreed to find a solution to their differences and to bring relations back to a positive track, and that they would consider each other's legitimate concerns and to reach a mutually acceptable solution as soon as possible. Now, the big question, and always the devil is in the details beyond these broad statements, but at least what we do know is that the two sides have agreed to maintain communication through diplomatic and military channels. Now, this follows on from that meeting that you mentioned there between the two foreign ministries of both sides, both countries agreeing to work towards withdrawing those tens of thousands of troops along the border. As you also know, tanks and jets stationed out there too. The question, though, is while this may seem like a positive step and a thaw in what has been a rocky relationship, the question is how long will this last for? From China's perspective, it's not expecting a change in the overall approach by India towards China, but it definitely does have interest in seeking a better relationship with its neighbour. Wei Su.
Olivia, are these interests the main reason we're seeing this relative improvement in ties between China and India?
Wait, so any escalation in this border crisis would be seen by both countries as detrimental to it. It is a border dispute, but it goes beyond that if things were to escalate. We're talking about implications on the diplomatic front, on the political front, and on the economic front. And remember that to China, it has said that the border issue is just one part of the bigger bilateral relationship that it has with India. And one very big part of it has been that China is India's largest trading partner. In fact, trade has gone up in recent years. This also comes as China itself is facing economic headwinds and those tensions with the U.S. and the West. And so having a better relationship, especially a trading relationship with its neighbor like India, would be beneficial for it, even if it cannot resolve some of the more tricky fundamental issues. This also comes as China has increasingly tried to galvanize countries in what's known as the global south, which India is part of, and China trying to position itself as a leader of this part of the world as well. And we have seen China try to talk up how it's extended goodwill towards India, including facilitating visas for Indians to travel to China and people-to-people exchanges. But it's clear that differences do remain. China continues to be unhappy by India limiting visas to Chinese citizens following that 2020 incident, also banning a slew of Chinese mobile apps, including TikTok, and reducing direct flights between the two countries. Now, there are also reports which suggest that Indian authorities are considering relaxing restrictions on Chinese investments into the country. But then we also have heard that the Indian government saying that there will be no rethink on investments into China, but the Chinese still remaining hopeful that this could change, as they say it's the India's loss when it comes to boosting tourism and its economy. Wei Su.
Oh, thanks for explaining that very complex relationship. Rebecca Bundon in Mumbai and Olivia Xiong there from Beijing. A senior diplomat from North Korea who recently defected to South Korea says the North is preparing to reopen nuclear negotiations with Washington if Donald Trump returns to office as U.S. president. Ri Il-gyu recently made headlines for being the highest-ranking North Korean diplomat to defect to the South since 2016. He says Pyongyang is working to devise a negotiating strategy should Mr. Trump win the U.S. election in November. The goal would be to get sanctions lifted on its weapons programs and its designation as a state sponsor of terrorism removed. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met Mr. Trump several times during his presidency, but talks collapsed over disagreements over sanctions.
이번에는 분명 왼송에 힘이 실리고 왼송이 하게 되겠는데 아마 쉽지 않을 거예요, 이번에는. 옛날 1차 때처럼 아무것도 안 주고 4년 동안 말하자면 북한의 손발을 이렇게 묶어놓기가 쉽지 않을 겁니다. 아마.
South Korea has proposed sending relief supplies to North Korea as the country reels from recent heavy rainfall damage. Officials say aid is being offered to Pyongyang to assist flood victims, regardless of ongoing security tensions.
우리 측은 북한 주민들이 처한 인도적 어려움에 대해 인도주의와 동포애의 견지에서 북한의 이재민들에게 긴급히 필요한 물자들을 신속히 지원할 용의가 있음을 밝힙니다. 지원 품목, 규모, 지원 방식 등에 대해서는 북한 적십자회 중앙위원회와 협의할 준비가 되어 있으며 조속한 호응을 기대합니다.
The proposal to send relief comes amid flaring tensions on the Korean peninsula, with both sides engaging in tit-for-tat propaganda, including the floating of balloons filled with rubbish from the north and the south resuming loudspeaker broadcasts. Although Pyongyang did not disclose details about casualties from recent downpours, Seoul's Unification Ministry believes the number of those who died or went missing is in excess of about 1,000. The North state media did carry reports of heavy rain pounding cities near its border with China, in cities such as Sinuiju and Uju. More than 4,100 houses and nearly 3,000 hectares of farmland were reportedly submerged. And still ahead on East Asia tonight. A stronger yen striking fear among investors in Japan, stocks falling by their most since 2020. A new report says ASEAN is poised to outpace China's economic growth for the next 10 years.
Football 24/7. I hope I become a professional footballer, get scouted.
He has the greatest courage. He never backs down.
Saturday on Japan Hour.
上下線のサービスエリアのコンセプトが異なってまして、
場所が高いから地中海みたいな、本当そういう雰囲気。
地域色を取り入れてですね、エリアを展開していけるようにですね、この部署としてもですね、日々いろいろ工夫をしているところです。
久しくコロナでやってなかったコンテストね、ハイウェイ飯。これはご飯ノンストップですね。
Japan Hour, Saturday on CNA. Japan Hour is brought to you by Sumitomo Corporation. MUFG, committed to empowering a brighter future. Zip Air, summer fares are now available. And iChai.
China's ruling Communist Party has expelled Wang Yilin. Now he's the former chairman of its petroleum corporation known as CNPC on charges of corruption. According to state-run media CCTV, Wang had illegally accepted high-value goods and assets in exchange for helping individuals get recruited, promoted, or secure business deals. Wang also accepted travel arranged by private business owners on multiple occasions. In 2020, Wang stepped down from his position as chairman and party secretary at CNPC after reaching retirement age, although he did stay on as deputy director of the Communist Party's top economic advisory body. As he awaits investigation by prosecutors, Wang is no longer listed as a member of the Economic Committee on the organization's website. This is not the first time the ruling party has expelled high-ranking officials for corruption. Last year, 2 former defense ministers were sacked, including Li Shangfu, who had served for just 7 months at the time. The reason given then was that Li had seriously violated party discipline and law. It's over to Olivia Marzuki from CNA's business desk, who has the latest from Japan's stock market. Olivia, the Nikkei is suffering heavy sell-offs from a strong Japanese yen.
Yes, Wei, so that's right. And the recent yen surge is sending jitters across the equity scene. And that's in the aftermath of the BOJ's historic policy decision yesterday when interest rates were hiked for the second time in 17 years. Now, the benchmark Nikkei 225 ended the day deep in the red. Index heavyweights such as Honda, Yamaha Motor, all tumbling as a stronger yen hurts their export earnings. Toyota led the losses in Tokyo today, even after it posted a 12% jump in its Q1 revenue and a 17% rise in profit in line with projections. The world's biggest car maker says a weaker yen is actually helping to boost its income in the domestic market. And its hybrid models are selling pretty well in North America, making up for stagnant demand in Japan and China. Now, Japanese equities at large are witnessing a massive rush of foreign funds outflow. Overseas investors offloaded their shares for a second week in the biggest fund outflow since last September, as a stronger yen puts a downward pressure on stocks. The Japanese currency continues to go firmer, now at levels around 149.97 to the greenback. It has recently turned the tide to become the best performing major currency. And the BOJ's hawkish tilt, also the impending Fed rate cut, are expected to narrow the policy gap that has driven record weakness in the yen. And China's state planner says promoting domestic consumption will take on a, quote, more prominent position as the country seeks to address one of the biggest drags on its economy. Measures include encouraging spending on household appliances and boosting tourism by making it easier for foreigners to travel to China. Olivia Seong reports.
Officials of China's state planner have warned of a critical period ahead, even as they lauded the country's hard-won economic achievements in the first half of the year. The vice chairman of the National Development and Reform Commission noted that the adverse effects caused by changes in the external environment are increasing. Domestic demand is insufficient, and there are still many hidden dangers. But he said a holistic view is needed.
这些困难挑战 既有呢外部环境变乱交织的影响，也有呢经济结构变革推动高质量发展过程当中，我们必须要经历的阵痛。另一个方面呢，我想我们更要看到经济运行当中积极因素和有利条件 也在不断的积累。我们有条件、有能力、有信心，也有底气，战胜呢发展当中的问题，转型当中的挑战，高质量完成全年的目标任务。
Mr. Zhao said there is still enough room for counter-cyclical policy adjustments. China's GDP grew by a slower than expected 4.7% year-on-year in the third quarter. Officials have been holding a series of news conferences elaborating on the broad policy direction set out by the Communist Party at its twice-a-decade third plenum held earlier this month. This also comes amid calls for more stimulus measures to address China's economic challenges, as some observers have said that the GDP growth target set by the country of around 5% for this year is ambitious. A major drag has been weak domestic consumption. Retail sales went up by just 2% in June, slowing from 3.7% growth the month before. Over 300 billion Chinese yuan, or about $41 billion in ultra-long-term special treasury bonds has been earmarked to increase support for a large-scale equipment trade-in and consumer goods replacement program. This expanding on an existing policy to boost spending, which some analysts say has had limited impact so far.
其中呢，包括直接向地方安排1500亿元左右，支持地方呢实施消费品以旧换新，更加快速便捷的让政策的这个真金白银呢直达消费者，更好满足居民消费升级的需求。我们相信呢，这个政策效应呢将会不断的显现。
Mr. Yuan said efforts would also be made to promote spending on goods like automobiles, as well as in services like education and elder and child care. Developing cultural and sports tourism will also be promoted, along with measures to make it easier for foreigners to travel in China. To address challenges facing China's real estate sector, the other drag on economic growth, the country's state planner recently also issued a notice to promote the regular issuance of infrastructure REITs. Olivia Xiong, CNA, Beijing.
China's factory activity unexpectedly shrank for the first time in 9 months, signaling weakness in one of its main growth engines. Caixin manufacturing PMI contracted to 49.8 in July, and the weaker than expected reading is likely to because of the slowing momentum in overseas shipments and geopolitical uncertainty. The private survey follows official data that shows that factory activity shrinking for a third straight month in July. This is the latest warning sign, and it's probably going to call for more measures to stimulate growth. China's economy had been bolstered by robust exports and industrial production this year amid subdued consumption and the ongoing property crisis. But producers remain optimistic about output in the coming year, with the levels of optimism improving from June. It is quite a different picture for the rest of Asia, which saw manufacturing activity continuing to expand in July. This is according to data published by the S&P Global. Factories in much of North Asia stayed in expansion territory. Now, checking on the Greater China markets today, all the indices ended the day in the red. Shanghai and Shenzhen, they're closing about 0.2% for Shanghai, Shenzhen nearly 1% down, and the Hang Seng dipped 0.2% at the closing bell. Now, Southeast Asia is likely to outpace China's economic growth and inflow of foreign direct investments over the next 10 years. According to a new study by Angsana Council, Bain & Co. and DBS Bank, the ASEAN 6, that's Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, are expected to surpass China's projected growth of 3.5 to 4.5% by 2034. Breaking it down by countries, Vietnam is expected to lead with 6.6%, followed by the Philippines, while Singapore, the slowest among the 6, is expected to manage 2.5%. Foreign direct investment to Southeast Asia is expected to rise further. Last year, The six economies attracted more foreign capital than China the first time in a decade, totaling $206 billion compared to $42.7 billion for China. The U.S. tops China as the region's largest source of FDI at $37 billion in 2022, with more than half of that going into manufacturing and finance sectors. Thailand and Indonesia are emerging as regional hubs for electric vehicle supply chains, attracting the most FDI at about $14 billion in the past 5 years. Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam are expanding semiconductor production across different parts of the value chain, while the region is broadly benefiting from a boom in data center investments. But sticking points remain, with the report warning that Southeast Asia needs to improve its service provision and innovation to remain ahead of China. The transformation comes at a time when the world has become increasingly protectionist, with many businesses diversifying away from China to avoid over-reliance on one market. Singapore Health Minister Ong Ye Kung is in China for the 14th Singapore-Guangdong Collaboration Council, where Singapore-based companies sign new projects with Chinese partners. Transport operator ComfortDelGro is eyeing a slice of Robotaxi services. It signed an MOU with Pony AI to explore commercial operations in China, with plans to expand internationally. Mr. Ong himself filmed this interview in a Robotaxi.
How is the service running in Guangzhou so far?
The service is running pretty good. Actually, Guangzhou is the first place to launch public-facing Robotaxi pilot in China. Back in 2018, we launched the first public-facing Robotaxi pilot in China. To date, we have driven more than 30,000 hours. No accident at all. Okay. No scratch at all.
Okay. And then to Mr. Cheng Siak-Kian, why do you want to foster this collaboration with Pony AI?
This is really about future-proofing our services. So currently we run about 9,000 taxis in China already. And we also know that both Singapore and China, the population is aging. So we actually need to look at how we can use new technology to actually get better services for our customers. Because otherwise, over time, you'll find that we actually don't have enough drivers to service. And also in certain time of the day, drivers actually tend not to want to service. So for example, you take Changi Airport, after midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, drivers are actually very, very hard to get drivers to want to service underserved areas. So we find that technology like this will be very helpful in the future.
So it complements the human drivers.
the man
very
services.
Good. Thank you. This is an interview by the Minister for Health.
And for the full story, do catch Asia Tonight at 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. And that's all for me from business. Wei Su, it's back to you.
Oh, thank you, Olivia. And still ahead on East Asia Tonight, how will the People's Liberation Army navigate an increasingly complex security environment as it marks its 97th anniversary? Our analyst provides some insights. China and India are speeding up talks in a bid to finally resolve a long-running dispute on the Himalayan border, 4 years after a military clash that killed dozens on both sides. North Korea readying for a restart of nuclear talks with the United States should Donald Trump return to office. All that is according to a senior diplomat who defected to the south. South Korea says it's prepared to offer flood relief to the north amid reports of 1,000 missing after heavy rain. China has hit out at the passage Wednesday of a Canadian warship through the sensitive Taiwan Strait, calls it a disruption of regional peace and stability. The spokesperson for the PLA's Eastern Theater Command warned that its troops are always, quote, ready to respond to any threats and provocations. Taiwan's defense ministry, on the other hand, called the situation normal, stressing the island's military maintained full control during passage of that vessel. Canada says it carried out the routine transit in compliance with international law. Western navies regularly conduct such freedom of navigation operations in regional waters in support of what they call a rules-based international order. But China views these transits along the strait and other contested areas as a challenge to its sovereignty. Taipei, meanwhile, reporting the detection of multiple Chinese vessels and aircraft off the coast of Taiwan in just the past day. Some aircraft also flew over the median line, which serves as an unofficial border between the two sides. Cross-strait tensions have escalated in recent years, with Taiwan's unofficial ally, the United States, further committing to defense for the island. The Chinese military has also regularly conducted large-scale war games close to Taiwan. China marks the 97th founding anniversary of its military today. According to Chinese state media, the People's Liberation Army spent the past 1 year improving its combat readiness to respond to what it's called a fast-changing security landscape. Chinese President Xi Jinping, speaking to officials this week, called for an upgrade of the border, coastal and air defense systems to make them, quote, strong and solid. Mr. Xi said foreign relations also play a major role, and China should work on what he called pragmatic cooperation with its neighbors on the security front. And for more, Zhou Bo joins us now. He's a retired senior colonel of China People's Liberation Army and is a senior fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. Thanks for joining us, Colonel Zhou. Now, China's defense minister calling what's happening right now on the Chinese landscape, it's at, as far as the military is concerned, at an historical juncture. If we agree with that, in what way are we at an historical juncture?
I think it has a lot to do with China's history because after founding of People's Republic of China, PLA is growing with strength. But now I think we are facing with some new situations. Basically, there are two situations. One is how could China safeguard its sovereignty and territorial integrity? And second, as a responsible power, how Chinese military could actually show that its international obligations. So whenever people talk about the PLA, it seems that it is always about the issues of Taiwan and South China Sea. This are true, but these are not the whole story, because the PLA is also trotting around the globe. For example, in peacekeeping missions, in counter-piracy, in disaster relief. So PLA definitely is becoming more and more involved in global affairs. This is why we aim to become a world-class military, not only in a better way to defend China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also be able to show the greater responsibility for the well-being of the world. As you know, the world nowadays is really not so safe. So was in conflict in Ukraine, was in conflict in the Middle East. But on both fronts, China actually is making efforts of mediation at the same time. So I think China now is more and more associated with global security, wherever it might be.
Colonel Zhou, of course, you could understand, just as there are concerns in the past with other countries, such as the United States, such as Japan before World War II, concerns when any country becomes extremely, evidently, assertively powerful on the military front. So as China strives to become, as it explicitly acknowledges, a world-class military power, how does it balance its need to defend itself with making it very clear to anyone who is concerned it's merely being a responsible global player?
I understand people's concern for any large military, but China's example is exceptional, because if you look at China's history, the last 40 years and plus, I would say that everybody would agree that China's rise is peaceful. So sometimes the Western media would portray China as a coercive, aggressive, in the South China Sea, in Taiwan Strait, blah, blah, blah. But they just cannot find an example of which Chinese military killing any foreigners, anywhere. Because there are some, casualties along China-Indian border, but that involves China's sovereignty. But elsewhere, you cannot give an example how Chinese actually have been using force. We haven't even killed a pirate in the Gulf of Aden, Somali Basin, although the Chinese flotilla have been operating there since the end of 2008. So China's rise is peaceful, and China probably is a unique example of being big but not threatening.
All right, just a quick, because this is one in our headlines today. So clashes with India, for example, in 2020 did lead to loss of lives of some Indian soldiers. Of course, the precise facts of that will never be entirely clear, but there are always casualties in any conflict, maybe not large numbers of them. Now, bringing this back, this is something that China has acknowledged itself. So the PLA, one weakness is, despite decades of serious reform and a huge increase, at least 800% in defense spending since 1992, it has not been tested in battle. So when you say you want to be a world-class military power, I take it means to be able to compete with the United States. But until you have actually gone to war, you will not actually know whether you are militarily up to grade. Is that a concern for reforms in the PLA at this point?
That is a great point. Actually, it is, although China wants to become a world-class military, but the question is, how can you prove you are a world-class military without fighting and winning the war? But this basically is a kind of dilemma. China cannot just try to test whether it's a world-class military or not by resorting to war, right? This is just like you cannot test whether your sword is sharp or not by chopping down somebody's head. So this is the dilemma. But however, this does not mean that the Chinese military cannot fight. As everyone knows, Chinese military actually has won a series of wars after founding of PRC. And nowadays, in terms of high-tech technology whatsoever, these actually have tremendous boost the Chinese military capabilities. These are not secrets, because the Chinese state-of-art weaponries and equipment were always on show during Tiananmen Parade, and the Western media always keep an eye on China's any military development. So all these together would actually make Chinese military much stronger. But yes, we haven't had a test of how strong PLA is. I wish such kind of test will never come true.
Yes, it should not be actually actively aimed for. Final question here. So reform of the PLA, in terms of, for example, the cleanup of corruption within the People's Liberation Army, that has been a concern for many Chinese leaders, even from the 1970s onward. Each leader has been constrained by all sorts of different factors. So they put it off, they shelve it. But President Xi Jinping, he did not begin the current crackdown on corruption, but certainly under his government, it has stepped up, and it is far more rigorous and wide-ranging and profound than it has ever been in the history of the PLA. So the problem with reform is you get to a certain point, you think by this year, but by that year, things have changed, again, internally and internationally. So if you want to be a world-class military, fully modernized by the middle of the century, where is China now, and where does it need to go in terms of either personnel or equipment? Final question.
I think you have raised a very good point. For PLA to become strong, it doesn't only need good equipment, it also needs good quality of personnel. And of course, we have to be clean. We have to be clean of corruption, so on and so forth. But what I need to point out are just two things. One is corruption was not only found inside the military. Actually, it was a very much rampant, just some time ago. But you have also pointed out that President Xi actually was very much, decisive and serious about combating, corruption. So my answer is, once we have found corruption, definitely we're determined to deal with it. We'll just let it stay there. So this is the only way we can just maintain a healthy and strong Chinese military.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Mr. Zhou Bo, retired senior colonel, China People's Liberation Army, and also senior fellow, Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. The United States remains focused on shoring up and reinvigorating alliances in Asia, even as the administration of President Joe Biden enters its final months. Here's more of what top U.S. diplomat Antony Blinken told CNA's Teresa Teng in an exclusive interview.
You've been busy, 6 countries, 10 days. I believe this is your 18th trip to the Indo-Pacific region, since becoming secretary. And I want to talk about one of the biggest announcements of this tour, which is the U.S. upgrading its military command structure in Japan. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin calls it one of the strongest improvements in U.S.-Japan military ties in 70 years. Why now?
I think what we're seeing across the board is something that President Biden was determined that we do from day one, and that was to reinvigorate, to, in some cases, even reimagine, but to start by reinvigorating our core alliances and our core partnerships. And we've done that around the world, but particularly we've done that in the Indo-Pacific region. As you mentioned, yes, it's the 18th time I've been to the region, even with everything else that's going on in other parts of the world. Our focus is here because we see our future as an Indo-Pacific country ourselves as very much being with this region. And when it comes to Japan or when it comes to Korea, where we have treaty alliances, we're going to make sure and continue to make sure that they have everything they need to be able to defend their sovereignty, defend themselves against any threats, and that they have the ability to work closely with us. And I think you see Japan that increasingly in recent years is stepping up to its responsibilities in historic ways. But what's so important about each of these alliances is that every single one of them is defensive in nature. There is no design on anyone else's territory. This is all about making sure that, as necessary, we can protect ourselves from threats and, most important, deter them from happening in the first place. So what we're doing with Japan, what we're doing with Korea, is very much what we're doing in different ways with other partners in the region. That's the intent behind it.
Still ahead on East Asia tonight, more young adults in Japan feeling lonelier than before. Find out why on CNA+.
Heading into the second half of 2024, the global economy remains resilient.
You would expect Asian currencies to start to recover.
But there are uncertainties amidst geopolitical tensions.
Unemployment is starting to creep up slowly.
So how should investors navigate? Market insights, optimism and caution in a resilient market. Tonight on CNA.
Brought to you by UOB Privilege Banking.
Young people in Japan are lonelier than ever.
自殺の数が増えるとか、不登校のや DV の数が増えるなどの様々な数字の悪化が見られました。
What is behind this social isolation?
家帰ってからもなんかもう一点をずっと見つめるみたいな。
You keep having this sense that you do not belong to the society.
Young and lonely in Japan. Insight tonight on CNA.
The second of Singapore's big three lenders is set to release its latest financial scorecard. We'll run through OCBC's Q2 results and see how the Fed's policy path and geopolitical tensions play into its quarterly earnings. Watch Asia First at these timings.
He literally breathes football 24/7.
I hope I become a professional footballer, get scouted.
He has the greatest courage. He never backs down.
Taiwan Strait is the beginning of Taiwan tea industry.
From a place that used to be trading tea, rice, and herbs, it now has so many more new things to offer.
我们就发起的这样的一个活动，希望呢他们能够来这边一边攀岩的时候呢，他们就会彼此的互相的认识。
Yes!
I think I fall in love with this place.
In November last year, loneliness was declared a pressing health threat by the World Health Organization. Feelings of social isolation and alienation have persisted post-pandemic, with 1 in 4 adults worldwide saying they feel lonely. In Japan, a 2023 survey found that almost 40% of respondents felt lonely at least occasionally. This was higher than it was in 2021, when Japan still had COVID-19 social distancing measures. Amongst Japanese, those in their 20s and 30s reported the highest levels of loneliness, more so than did the elderly. CNA's current affairs program Insight explores why Japanese youths are feeling that way.
名前はなっちゃんで、年齢は24歳、職業などは大学院生と市役所での非常勤の職員をやっております。
When she graduated from a prestigious university in Tokyo, Na-chan was faced with a dilemma: work in Tokyo like many of her classmates, or return to her hometown of Naka.
戻ろうとしたきっかけは、自分が大学院で研究をしているものが自分のふるさとであるっていうことと、あとはその街づくりの仕事を市役所の人から一緒にやらないかと声がかかったからです。
While the Tokyo metropolitan area is a bustling megapolis of some 37 million people, Naka, located 130 kilometers away, only has about 50,000 residents. Life here is a far cry from Japan's busy capital.
私があえて一人でいる理由としては、自分がやりたいことだったりやるべきことがたくさんあるからです。私が自由に過ごす時間としては、大体そうですね、1日1時間から2時間ぐらい、特に平日はやっぱり研究できる日が貴重なので、研究できる日はずっとほとんどの時間を研究に費やして、でここ数ヶ月はすごい忙しかったので、あまり友人と直接会って話すっていうことはしてはいないです。
Japan has some of the longest working hours in the world. Nearly 1/4 of Japanese companies requires employees to work more than 80 hours of overtime a month. Overwork has been linked to feelings of loneliness. And while one's colleagues can be a source of companionship, young adults found themselves in a post-pandemic work environment where opting out of social gatherings and working from home have become more widely accepted.
コロナ前に完全に戻っておりませんので、また就職する年代におきましても、例えば20代とか、30代の若手におきましても、 やはり会社での人付き合いがそもそも少なくなっているとか、
そういったことは若者の就労意欲やあとは結婚や子供を持つ意欲を削ぐと思いますので、そうすると経済的社会的なダメージになるかなというふうに思います。
And here, loneliness in Japan is evident in another way. One survey found that about a third of unmarried Japanese under 50 had never dated. This trend is particularly stark among young men, where almost 50% of those in their 20s said they had never had a girlfriend.
結婚はしたいんだけれども、結婚にお金がすごくかかるとか、子供を持つのにすごくお金がかかるという考えを持っていて、それは合ってるとは思うんですけれども、特に男性でそういうのは多くて、やっぱりそれは昔ながらの男性が稼ぐべきっていうような考え方はまだ根深く残っているのかなと思います。
On the other hand, many don't find marriage itself a panacea for loneliness. This is especially so for women.
日本は高度成長期において男性が仕事を持って働いて女性は専業主婦として家庭を支えるというモデルが定着して、この考え方が現在も根強く残っています。ところが女性が引きこもっていても、それは日本では例えば、ハウスキーピングをしていると言われたりとか、あるいは結婚していれば専業主婦という言葉もありますから、さほど周りがそれを問題視しないということもあって。
For the people who are married, they are not happy, not satisfied with their romance status, that would be very lonely. But then again, singlehood itself can be a real problem when you talk about loneliness. Do you know why? Because they have no one to turn to.
As for Natsan, her last romantic relationship was 1 year ago.
また一方で東京の大学で出会った子たちであって、で大学を卒業している人であっても、やっぱりこのくらいの年齢で恋人がいて結婚するっていうところがかなり多くの人がしているということがあって、私はそれに乗れてルートに乗っていないっていうところがすごい自分はおかしいんじゃないかって思ってしまうことがあります。そこの違いに悩まされて、違うということが自分は孤独で孤立しているのではないかと感じる時があります。
And that's East Asia tonight. Singapore viewers, do stay tuned for highlights from the Paris 2024 Olympics and headlines anytime at cna.asia.